first of all, I'm really interested in the idea of dual inheritance. So you talked earlier about how much human beings have achieved despite the human limitations. And it's something I've thought about a lot in regard to, for example, the Australian Aborigines. So why were they so primitive? And it seems to me that the reason is because there were so few of them and they were so isolated from the rest of the world. So they were isolated from the general exchange of ideas and even from each other. So we know from genetic studies that they lived, even the separate tribes lived very separately from each other. And I just imagine if I had been one of those Aborigines, for example, crossing over to Tasmania, I would have had no idea how to make clothes or make a boat, or let alone anything more advanced. So you need a minimum number of people in order to ensure that you have at least a few people who are innovative enough to invent things and solve technical problems and move humanity forwards. And the smaller the group, the less likely it is that you have someone like Elon Musk in the group as opposed to someone like me who could write nice poetry and maybe do some rock paintings, but wouldn't actually help to advance humanity technically at all. And so you talk a lot about this dual cultural and genetic inheritance as one of the things that characterizes humans and differentiates us from other animals. And you give a fascinating example about how chimps learn versus how human infants learn. Maybe you could start there and then talk a bit more about this dual inheritance concept.
Yeah, of course. So the experiment that you're referring to was run by Victoria Horner and Andy Whiten. And what they did was they took young chimps and young humans, and they gave them a box. I think they called it a magical fruit. And this box, it had a hole in the top and a hole in the side. A demonstrator, the experimenter, took a stick and poked their hole through the top and poked their hole through the side, so that the young chimps and the children could see this in separate conditions. And what they were able to do was then unlock a reward. So in poking their hole through the top and poking their hole through the side, the chimps got a piece of fruit and the children got a sticker. Children love stickers and chimps love fruit. So the experimenter handed this box to the chimps, and of course the chimps, being smart, they poked their hole through the top, poked their hole through the side, got their fruit, happy chimps. And then the experimenter did the same thing and handed it to the children, and of course the children poked the hole through the top, poked the hole through the side, got their sticker, happy kids. Now, in the key variation, it's the same box, except that instead of being opaque where you can't see what's going on inside, it's a completely clear box. And now it's very clear to the chimps and the children that that first action doesn't actually do anything. There's kind of a floor or a ceiling at the top, and it's only the side action that retrieves the reward. But still, the experimenters, took this box and they poked their hole through the top and poked their hole through the side, and they handed it to the chimps. Now, chimps are smart, right? If you've ever watched a chimp doing this working memory game, or you've watched a chimp, scrolling through Instagram, these are smart animals. And so they were like, what's this first action? Irrelevant. Go straight for the second action and retrieve the fruit, and the chimps are happy. But again, the experimenter pokes their hole through the top, pokes their hole through the side, and hands it to the children. What did the children do? Poke their hole through the top, poke their hole through the side. They copied exactly what the adults did. So what seems to be going on with our species is that your head is filled with these recipes, right? You don't even see them or notice them anymore. But ever since you were a child, you learned that you got to brush your teeth in the morning. Some people brush before breakfast, some people brush after, and everybody's got kind of a story around it, that you got to brush your teeth before to put some fluoride and get rid of the bacteria. You got to brush your teeth after because, you've just eaten food. You've got these stories, but really what you have are recipes without real causal understanding of what's going on. In other words, we've kind of deferred an understanding to the collective. We're engaging in a kind of crowd computing where instead of relying on hardware that allows us to figure things out over the course of our own lifetime, or figure things out just through trial and error learning, we can benefit from accumulated beliefs and values and behaviors and entire ways of thinking that are almost like software. They're apps that we get to download as children and then use as adults. And this shift from, if you like, just brain hardware to cultural software opens up all kinds of new possibilities. So we acquired new skills that our ancestors didn't have. And I think my favorite example of this is just counting, right? So many groups count like this: 1, 2, 3, many. And it takes a long time, before we start counting in a natural number system. And, what I just did with my fingers is what many groups around the world do. They use body parts to count, or they use stones or something like that. But because they're using these objects and then representing it eventually in their heads, like kids learn to count with their hands and then they stop doing that, concepts like zero are very difficult to convey. Negative numbers, up until the 17th century, there's a quote in my book from Francis Mazeries, this Canadian British mathematician, who says, in the 17th century or the 18th century, he says, negative numbers darken the very fabric of reality. These are awful, awful things. And the reason that we're able to acquire a new app and then transmit that to children easily is because we moved away from objects as a way to represent numbers in our brains to movement and position. So around then is when we started using number lines. And number lines make obvious the 0 point, as well as, give you a way of thinking about negative numbers. So we have these metaphors, we have these ways of transmitting entire skills. If I can have another example, if P then Q reasoning. So we often assume that humans are very logical, we're the rational animal and so on. Alexander Luria, he goes out to Uzbekistan in the 1920s, where there's this educational revolution going on. And he asks people these syllogisms, he says, where it snows, the bears are white. In Novaya Zemlya, it snows, what color are the bears? Now, you're going to say white. My 6-year-old says white. But when he asked the Uzbeks with education, they said white as well. But when he asked the Uzbeks without education, they said things like, I don't know, I've seen a brown bear once. Is it brown? I don't talk about things I don't know. So it's not, obviously humans are capable of reasoning, but it's not a kind of grounded way of thinking that we do naturally. And nothing is really, there is no such thing as kind of natural, as I kind of gave you in the quote from my book. What is natural are acquired skills that we get from our software that become instinctual. It's a little bit like the Stroop effect. Reading is so instinctual that it overrides color perception, where you have to say the color instead of read. You can't help but read. Now, obviously, we know the history of reading. And so that it's a culturally acquired skill. But much of your cognition is culturally acquired. And once you realize actually it's the software that's doing a lot of work, now you're asking different questions. You're like, well, why does the software vary between people? Why does it vary between groups? How has this software changed over time? How does it interact with our genes? How does it interact with, is it evolving? Like, how does it emerge? And that's the space of cultural evolution. And that's the kind of basis for understanding a theory of everyone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking as I was reading the book about Steve Stewart Williams' book, The Ape That Understood the Universe. He tells a story in that book of being in Borneo, and he watched as an orangutan stole one of their rafts, and he was punting like they do at Oxford and Cambridge. The orangutan used a pole and he was punting that raft away down the river. And he'd
Yeah.
obviously seen the humans doing this, so he imitated them. Very smart orangutan guy. And Steve said that his first thought on seeing that was, look at that ape using technology that he doesn't understand. And then it suddenly dawned upon him that this was equally true of us. But the difference is that the orangutan starts from scratch each time, or almost from scratch. There's no transmission of that knowledge of how to punt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, so exactly. I mean, so we benefit. So as I say in the book, like we are smarter than our short lifetime should allow for. Like we live in a world that not even the smartest, not even Elon Musk, if you like, could recreate. We're building on everything that came before, and that's really the secret to our success. It's not by genes alone that we make any of this happen. It's because we get the advantage of when both of us were born as babies. The first thing that we really had to do was to catch up on the last several thousand years of human history. And by that, I don't mean catch up on everything that had happened. I mean, catch up on all the developments in how to think, what is right and wrong, the technologies that are available to us, and we did it. So, education is one of the most effective institutions for downloading this cultural package, right? After education has been around, formal education has been around for a while, but after the Industrial Revolution, it becomes compulsory. Truancy laws start to emerge in the late 19th century. So well after, when we really, we took this factory model and we said, we're going to create factory workers. You're going to sit down, kids, and we're going to start phonemes, numbers, algebra, calculus. We're going to just download this way of thinking about the world. And we're going to do things like create deferred gratification. We're going to teach you to sit carefully, just like you're doing right now as I'm speaking, so that you can learn. And you'll not only learn these skills, but you learn how to learn. You will delay your gratification. You'll have patience, all of these things that are not natural to us. They're very, very trained. And because we live in a thoroughly schooled world where all of us went to school to some degree, and our media assumes some level of education and so on, we just don't see it anymore. And it's very, you have to go to far-flung places to really appreciate how much is not what it means to be human, but actually how much is conferred to us by our culture. And actually, as an aside, I think this is one of the things that AI researchers need to understand. What they're training is not like, it's not like the human brain gives us immediate abilities to be intelligent. It's that the human brain plus this cultural software. It's like having hardware without Excel, or any of the useful applications. You can't really do much with a computer unless it has an operating system with several applications.
It's one of the interesting things is that in a way the chimps are more rational than the babies
They
in
are,
that
yeah.
experiment. The chimps are figuring it out from first principles and they see you don't need to poke the stick in the top, whereas the babies are just slavishly copying. And I found that kind of fascinating that part
Yeah.
of what makes it possible for us to advance is that we have this social tendency to copy others.
Hmm.
Whereas rather than trying to work things out ourselves from first principles, most of us never do that. I mean, I have enough trouble with time zones as it is, but if I had to actually try to work out from the Earth's rotation what time zone I was in versus someone else, it would
Yeah.
be absolutely impossible. We wouldn't even be able to talk to each other now because I would never have figured out
Right.
I would never have worked out how to calculate it. But I have the social instinct to just go and see what other smarter people have done and accept that and follow that.
Yeah, that's right. So, what makes it cultural evolution and not just idea transmission, if you like, is that there's good evidence that culture is actually evolving beyond conscious awareness in the same way that, genetic evolution allows you to have design without a designer, without an intelligent designer. Cultural evolution is working the same way. So, any evolutionary system needs just three ingredients, right? You need diversity or variation, you need faithful transmission, and you need some kind of variation reduction, so selection, if you like, in the direction of more adaptive and less of the stuff that's not adaptive. And so part of this is that humans have, like, the reason we're different to, so other apes, as you pointed out with orangutans and even in this experiment, apes can imitate. They do have some ability to do that, at least some limited ability, but they don't have the proclivity to do that. So they don't tend to do that. And that's because they're not filled with a world where people actually have useful solutions that they could just copy. Like, we are the kids in class who cheat, right? We don't need to work out why brushing your teeth works, or why you got to cook, your meat and your vegetables a certain way in order to get a nutritious meal. Like, you don't have to work out any of that stuff. You don't have to know medicine to take advantage of a hospital. So this is why, the faithful transmission, this copying without understanding, is actually essential to that second ingredient of evolution. If we were trying to work it out, the system wouldn't work. We would be like chimps, kind of sitting naked in the rain. And then we do it selectively. So we're not copying people at random. We're looking for signs of success. People are influenced by Elon Musk because he has demonstrated success. He makes some pretty wild claims. And if those same wild claims were made by the homeless guy on the street, people would just laugh. But because he has success and because he's prestigious, other people are copying him. Because he's wealthy, he's got these markers of expertise. This makes him a figure that you're copying. So you're not copying at random. You're copying selectively the people who seem like they've got some knowledge worth paying attention to. And because of that filtering process, the population itself becomes worth copying, right? So if you're born, maybe you're traveling and you go somewhere you haven't been before and you don't know where the public bathrooms are or how to order or, what the norms are for queuing. You just look around and you do what other people do. And that's what kids do as well, right? They tend to conform. This is what we call peer pressure. They just copy what other people are doing. And so it's a good thing to do. It's a clever thing to do when most people are using behaviors that are adaptive because they've been filtered by generations upon generations of selective social learning. So culture becomes this evolutionary system. And, we had an economy before we had economists, right? Like, we create these technologies and then we try to reverse engineer them. I mean, even the steam engine, we got there before we got to the laws of thermodynamics.
Mm, that's really interesting. It's like other people are kind of an outsourced brain for us. Part of our
Exactly.
technology as humans is the collective wisdom of other people.
That's it. Yeah.
Um,
So Joe Henrik and
it's
I call this
also
the collective
yeah.
brain. Um,
Mm, mm,
and we it's meant to be an analogy, but it also, behind it is, some sensible mathematics about, so you mentioned, Australia as a relatively isolated region of the world, but even within
mm,
Australia, Tasmania had some of the least technologically and culturally sophisticated populations, right? when
mm,
when Europeans arrived in Australia, when they arrived in Tasmania, they weren't sure if they were seeing kind of a subspecies of human. They weren't sure what was going on because they had lost the ability to make warm clothing. They were transmitting fire in the specific way rather than making it from scratch. They were using rafts instead of boats. They would just kind of rub fat on their bodies to stay warm. Their fishing technology, it was the toolkit was much smaller than even their cousins on the mainland. And what was interesting is when they looked across the archaeological record, it wasn't just that they had a smaller toolkit than their cousins across the mainland. They had less than their own ancestors. And so actually, one of my first
Yeah.
papers was an experimental test of there's kind of two competing models as to how that happens. One is a kind of cultural drift model akin to genetic drift. When you have a small population, ideas just get lost. And the other model was the model developed by Joe Henrich, which is let's call it the Henrich transmission model, where learning is lossy. So if all these people are trying to learn from Elon Musk, most of them won't be as good. There's a reason that whoever the successful person is successful. There's a that they are outliers on a multitude of traits and a particular life trajectory and experiences and so on that's hard to recreate. And so most won't be as good. But with some probability, as the population grows in size, there'll be at least one person to replace that person every generation. So the math implies a relationship between not actually just population size, but sociality.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Sorry, there was a sound there. The size and interconnectedness of a population is connected to it's the level of cultural complexity that can maintain in the absence of books and so on, which actually increase your effective population size. And so we were able to show that experimentally. So in an experimental setting, we're able to show that with a larger, more actually the same size population but more interconnected, you can first off accumulate culture faster. And to a higher degree. And if you start a population like the Tasmanians did with some amount of technology, they'll lose it more slowly if they're more interconnected, and they'll equilibrate at a higher level if they're more interconnected, just as we see in Tasmania. So one of the things about Eurasia, right, is that Eurasia has a very large collective brain. We've had ideas flowing across this continent, this, back and forth for millennia. And so you've got these ideas flowing back and forth, recombining, creating something new that the rest of the world didn't get to enjoy. And so you see far more technological and cultural complexity across Eurasia than you find on the other continents.
Have you read Emily St. John Mandel's novel? I think it's called Station 11. It's about...
It's turned into a TV series, right?
I haven't seen the TV series, but the novel's premise is that there has been an apocalypse which has completely destroyed the power sources in everywhere on Earth. And so gradually all of the batteries run flat and none of the technology is working anymore. And there is also, I think, a pandemic. So many of the scientists and technical people die. And we're following a group of actors. So these are not people who are likely to restart technological civilization. And it's about the loss of technology and technical knowledge and even societal organization. Everything breaks down. It's like the situation that happened to the Tasmanians, but on a global scale.
Yeah, that's right. So the Tasmanians aren't the only example. I think it's in the Arctic region. This is exactly what happened. So, a disease came through and killed the adults. And so there's this massive skill loss. And so when they were found, they'd lost a whole bunch of things. And it's what would happen to us, right? If you're a small country or if you're a large country, or if you just don't do things for a long time. So here's an example. I am, one of the things I'm absolutely delighted about is that nuclear is back on the agenda, right? In part because of AI and data center requirements. We're building nuclear again, which will forestall a lot of the concerns that I had in my book. But because we've kind of lost a generation, we don't have the nuclear engineers that we need anymore. And so we have to retrain those individuals into the future. I would say it's a good bet for your kids if you're thinking about that. But it's an example, right, where it's easy to lose these kinds of things.
Yeah, that segues nicely over into the second, I think, major theme in your book, which is energy. As my best friend Maya, who you've met, always says, it all comes down to energy. This is what we need in order to create more complex life and more complex societies. And you talk in the book about the gap between the energy floor and the energy ceiling, that space in which all possibility for social advancement takes place. Can you say more about that concept, the limited energy, and how that has developed and progressed?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a good entry into this is how I started thinking about energy. So I was working on cooperation, which is one of the central themes of my work. And in 2005, Science Magazine labels the puzzle of large scale cooperation as one of the top 25 puzzles for the coming quarter century. So it's an important topic that's economists look at it, biologists look at it, cultural evolution people, and so on. And the focus was on identifying mechanisms of cooperation. So, some of the listeners might be familiar with inclusive fitness or kin selection. Genes that can identify and favor copies of themselves will spread at the expense of genes that don't. And that explains why related individuals will cooperate with one another. Direct reciprocity, reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, or an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, explains repeated encounters between individuals, like in your workplace or something, or in a small village. Indirect reciprocity, reputation systems. So when I met you, Iona, in Australia, what a pleasure, but I'd heard about you. Your reputation preceded you, and so therefore I
Oh,
was more
thank you.
likely to to have a chat because of that reputation, right? If I ask my colleagues in the economics department, they'll say institutions, the right institutions, non-extractive institutions that can sustain. So it's not actually that I'm just favoring it's not just that I'm working with my family. It's not just that I'm working with people I know or even people I know of. We live in societies of anonymous strangers because I pay taxes. And those taxes are used for a police force and a judiciary and government and so on that sustain this very high level of cooperation. And so it seemed like the puzzle had been solved. Like we now understood these scales of cooperation. But when I was looking at this, I thought, well, hang on a second, hang on. All of those scales exist at the same time, and they're not always in alignment. Sometimes what's good for my family isn't good for the state. Sometimes what's good for my friends is not good for meritocracy or something like that. One of the papers that I worked on in graduate school was demonstrating this. So we set up a public goods game, and we set up a perfect institution in this public goods game. And then we showed that you would get the opposite predictions. If you make the institution stronger, you would get stronger cooperation unless you introduce a second scale of cooperation, which is direct reciprocity. That is effectively what bribery is. And so, corruption is just one scale of cooperation undermining another. It's not actually a puzzle at all. The puzzle is how you get these higher scales. So, when a leader gives their son a contract, we call that nepotism, but it's inclusive fitness undermining our institutions. If a manager gives her friend a job on the basis of that friendship, that is direct or indirect reciprocity undermining our meritocracy, for example. So if that's the case, then identifying those mechanisms is not a solution to this. And we have to explain how humanity went from operating at levels of bands to villages to kingdoms, princedoms, kingdoms, nations, and now unions of nation states. You have to be able to explain that. And so, I started looking over this history and just thinking about the problem. And at the same time, I have a diverse educational background. And so as I was reading the energy sciences, I felt comfortable doing that just with engineering training. I was reading energy budgets in evolutionary biology, thinking about cooperation between cells and multicellularity. And I realized there is a common currency across this whole thing. And that is the availability of excess energy. Like that's what turns, non-life into life. Anything you can do is amplified if you have access and control over energy. So, if you look, the earliest life was moving at plant pace, if you like, through photosynthesis. And one of the major moves was the storage of that for later use. So even today, one of the problems with solar power is that you have to be able to store it for later use. Otherwise, you don't have power when the sun isn't shining. And initially, prior to mitochondria and ATP, they weren't able to store that. You only could move when there was heat or so on, right? And then once you can store things, then it opens these new spaces of possibilities. So first off, there's efficiencies, oxidation during photosynthesis, for example. I think it's like a 9 times efficiency increase. But then you can also evolve new animals that don't bother with photosynthesis, but eat other animals and take their energy for themselves. Right. And so then this can lead to ever increasing complexity, but there's a ceiling on the whole thing, which is this availability of energy. So I was like, okay, well, if that's true, then we should see this link between energy and the scale of cooperation. And that's exactly what you see. So everything's plodding along, and then you get these little leaps through energy improvement. So the first one was fire, right? Fire allows you to pre-digest food. And if the best evidence, I think, of evolution is the fact that you are born of cultural evolution, is that you are born into a world that requires cooked food because your jaw is too weak and your gut is too short to eat raw food. But you don't have genetic abilities to make fire. That means you require this cultural transmission of fire and cooking in order to survive. It's the first one.
I
Second one,
absolutely don't have any abilities to make fire. I can only
there
strike a
you go.
match.
It's hard. It's hard. Agriculture was another technology, right? So we moved from harvesting and grinding. Sorry, we moved from hunting and gathering to harvesting and grinding, where instead of walking around using calories to get, to hunt game or acquire tubers or something like that, we were stationary, we were sedentary, and we were probably dropping seeds at first and watching them grow, and then intentionally, these are innovations in efficiency, learning to grow these and expanding and hunt. And just like with the evolution of eukaryotic life, or life eating other life, the agriculturalists, although they were less healthy, because of that energy surplus that they suddenly had, pushed the hunter gatherers to the margins where what that weren't suitable for agriculture. So the hunter gatherers ended up in deserts and thick rainforests where they still live today. And then the next major shift that really, so we lived for the longest time, agriculturalists were fighting with other agriculturalists in this kind of Malthusian world, a zero sum world. And to exit that zero sum world and enter the positive sum world that we live in today was when we discovered stored sunlight in the ground, and through innovations in efficiency learned to put that to work. That stored sunlight was peat turned to black rock that we call coal, and the cheap available coal in Britain allowed them to launch the Industrial Revolution. And then later the use of oil and natural gas, so zooplankton, algae turned to oil and natural gas. These are dense carbon batteries, if you like. There's different metrics that are important in the energy sciences. To keep things simple, I focus on energy return on investment, which is it's ROI. It's the amount of energy it takes to get some amount of energy back, and it applies across all of these systems. So if a cheetah spends more energy chasing down that game than they get back when they eat that game, that cheetah is going to die. The energy return is not high enough. With fossil fuels, the energy return was massive, and this incentivized us to use that more efficiently and do more with it. So what I call this kind of space of the possible is that there's an energy ceiling based on the energy return on investment of your energy technology, and an efficiency floor. As we get more and more efficient, we expand and are able to do it more and more. And for the longest time, we never had to think about the energy ceiling because there was so much of it. One stat I point out is just look at oil discovery rates. In 1919, 1 barrel of oil found you another 1,000 barrels of oil. It's massive energy return on investment. By 1950, 1 barrel of oil found you another 100. And it's not until 2010 that 1 barrel of oil found you another 5. So now suddenly that ceiling matters, and there's a limit to the efficiency. There's a particular amount of joules that's required to heat a house, as I said, And so this thing's falling on us, and for the first time we had to think about it, and we should be, incorporating those into our models of economic growth, for example. And together you can begin to understand it. So if we shift up the ceiling again, a lot of the cooperative problems happen. So in the book, I talk about 4 laws: that energy, efficiency, the cooperation that happens in that space, which is a function of working together to access more than you would get working by yourself. And then this evolutionary process.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the less energy you have, the more conflict you have. The fewer resources you have, the more difficult it is to get people to cooperate, and also to get people to live in harmony. Of course, I mean, if you're fighting over scraps, then that is a very unpleasant situation. What you want is abundance,
Exactly.
maximum
Yeah.
abundance. So you want to keep raising the floor, and for that you need more energy.
Yeah.
I felt
It's
that
easier.
the
It's easier to
last
be,
part.
Ayana. Just quickly say, it's easier to be nice when there's more to go
Sure.
around. And the reason that the
Yeah, of
line's got to
course.
keep going up is that if the line doesn't go up, and if growth slows down, it incentivizes zero sum conditions. Because when growth is stagnant, or it slows down, it means that your win is my loss, because there's only a limited amount of stuff, right? And we're fighting
Yeah.
over that. That's the return to the Malthusian world. And as the populations grow to kind of reach that new carrying capacity, it gets less and less, and it incentivizes a very, very different psychology. Then the line goes up, and I can get things without you having less, because the actual pie is growing. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm quite a lot more optimistic than you were towards the end of your book about energy possibilities, because first of all, uranium is extremely abundant, much more so than fossil fuels. And it's even an element that is unlike fossil fuels that we're continuing to generate. Like uranium is formed in the sea by the interaction between seawater and rocks. And then you also have the breeder reactors, which are able to run on nuclear waste, and new thorium salt reactors, which are even much more efficient. And thorium is also a really abundant element. So there's more possibilities there. And then hopefully, we keep returning to Elon Musk, but hopefully we can get into our reusable rockets, go off to Mars, and from there we can create a base from which to mine the asteroids. So
So
I
yeah.
feel that every time. Oh, sorry.
No, just
Yeah,
with
go ahead.
I think of the book as an optimistic book, actually, just like, or a realistic book.
Mm,
In that, so uranium is actually, it's formed through supernova or neutron star
mm,
collisions, I think. It's this very, very heavy element. The technology actually, I think, is there. For all of the technologies you mentioned, and there may be, I think we're quite far from a growth limit on this planet, but the line can continue to go up if we're talking about, extraplanetary resources and asteroid mining and so on, and making that cheap and easy enough to do. So I should say, like, I personally had a, like, my goal is to make to make our species multiplanetary, but I don't think the primary limit to that is the technology. The primary limit to that is our ability to work together, our ability to govern ourselves under conditions of mass migration, for example, that are, that's going to become increasingly a concern through climate change, or wars over water, or resources, or whatever the case might be. This, to me, is what's actually holding us back. Like, if
Yeah.
we can work together as countries and unions of countries, the technology is there. It's a matter of will, of civil will and political will to invest in them.
Mm.
I think it's happening anyway in the private sector, thank goodness. But that I mean, that's what I work on. So that what motivates me, what gets me up in the morning, is like, how do we create the conditions for more positive sum conditions, and how do we have better immigration policies, and policies that allow diverse individuals to work together and reap the benefits without paying the costs, and how do we get away from this kind of ideological thing, and how do we have, greater freedom of speech and greater robustness to hear ideas that we don't like, that kind of thing, because these are essential to accelerating cultural evolution and getting us off this planet.
I want to just ask, am I completely wrong about uranium being formed from mineral reactions in between
I think so.
seawater and
Yeah,
certain elements in rocks? Okay,
I think so.
we'll edit that out because I
Yeah,
think I
edit that
must
out.
have misunderstood that. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, I don't mean that's the primary way uranium came to be, but it's related elements. Yeah. Anyway, I'll edit that out. That's from Marco Vischer's book, but I must have misunderstood that part. So you talk about a living the fact that we're living through what you call a second enlightenment,
Mhm.
and that has a lot to do with the internet. And can you talk a bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so you can actually draw. It's more speculative the further you go back, but you might be able to draw a line from kind of the Black Death to Renaissance, Enlightenment, and so on. Where the Black Death in Europe, which kills about 30 to 40% of the population. So, we have a model of this, and I talk about it in the book, which is that uh, when you increase that space of the possible, you increase the carrying capacity, so you get more people that catch up. But eventually, because of innovations in efficiency, you actually don't need that many people. So the per person output is it could be better if you lost a few people. So this kind of sudden loss reorganizes society, creates a middle class, shakes things up. That embeddedness of the feudal class starts to disappear, and so on. Anyway, that's a side of it, kind of an aside. So before you get to industrialization, you have this kind of enlightenment where ideas are flowing. So you've got the printing press, you've got pamphlets flowing across, you've got people challenging the ideas of old. And you've got an increase in our collective brain because of these new interconnections that are being created, these ideas that are now spreading across and recombining and doing all these amazing things. And this lays the
This is what
foundation for everything to
I
come.
wrote a book about this.
Did
This is
you?
what I wrote my first book on. Yeah. Sorry, go
Nice.
ahead.
So I think we're all very much on the same page. Um, and then after that, you get this kind of industrial revolution. So that empowers the technology that's going to take advantage of the fossil fuels that we eventually get, so that we can industrialize. So what I argue is actually what we're living through today. So people talk about kind of the first, second, third, fourth industrial revolution. I think there was one industrial revolution, and then innovations in efficiency after that. This unlocking of energy, and then ways of putting that to use. And what we're living through today is not another industrial revolution. It is the precursor to it. It is this enlightenment that is empowered, instead of the coffee shops that people gathered to talk to one another, and the pamphlets that were shared between these coffee shops through Europe. We instead have X. We instead have social media. We instead have Substack. We instead have podcasts like this one, where ideas are flowing across between people. They're being challenged. They're being shared in these kind of small spaces. They're being discussed online. It's laying the foundations for that technological revolution. If you look at Less Wrong, for example, Yudkowsky and is kind of motivating Sam Altman and so on to try to create this world. This is the second enlightenment that's going on, and what hopefully comes out of that is a true second industrial revolution. By my definition, has to be an energy revolution. So from this, we get to abundant nuclear, which is more than what we require for quite some time, and I would say potentially even fusion. As I say, fusion is always between next month and in the next 30 years. But for the first time, there are several viable technologies, and there is private and public sector investment, and potentially more as our energy needs increase. So that, those two things, or these high energy return on investment technologies could truly create that second industrial revolution, because everything else will follow. You increase that space as possible, the evolutionary process itself will incentivize higher scales of cooperation, because people who can get together and work together to take advantage of that will outcompete those that don't. The agriculturalists will win, or in this case, the AI people or something.
It's always been the case in the past that whenever people have prophesied doom and gloom on the basis of scarcity of a particular element or a particular resource, we have always solved that problem by finding a way to do without that resource through a new and alternative and different technology. There have been various examples of this in the past, which I'm not recalling right now, but there have been several crises where we thought, God, we don't have enough neodymium or whatever it is. Society is going to have a complete breakdown. And then along come the next generation of technological things, and they don't require neodymium at all. So it seems to me that even if we don't have fusion, we will surely at some point come up with a new technology. And what we need is just to build up enough nuclear to tide us over until that
Could be.
discovery happens.
Yeah, it could be. So,
Yeah.
so this is why, like I said, I think it's the social side of things that really need to be solved.
Mm.
Preventing people from going to war or at each other's throats, or, societies breaking down and not voting for things that lead to progress and, and increases in human welfare. So, a lot of things are fungible. Like, we eventually work out new technologies. There's some, so I don't talk about phosphorus in the book, but it is a potential limiting, like a serious limiting agent that might not have a replacement. In other cases, we figured new things out. So, I talk about Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution. Like, it's not, fossil fuels they weren't just in factories and allowing us to fly across the planet in airplanes and other vehicles. We're literally eating our fossil fuels. So, through nitrogen in the air and the ammonia from natural gas, we are that through the Haber-Bosch process, we're able to synthesize fertilizer that has then led to a further at least 4 billion people on this planet alive today. So we had the second green agricultural revolution, if you like, on the back of this energy technology. So the first one was just using the sun to grow stuff, and the second was using this fertilizer to have the chemicals to grow stuff far more abundantly than you're able to do than you're out this. So yeah, I mean, I think one thing to say is that past results are no guarantee of future results. The fact that violence has declined doesn't mean that it will continue to decline. And in fact, one of the things in my book is I make an opposite prediction to Pinker's decline of violence. Although, to be fair to Steve, I don't think he would say it can't reverse. But to me, World War I and World War II were not aberrations. The thing is that my take on the decline of violence is it is the corollary to the increase in cooperation. As the size of the cooperative groups increase, it means that internally within those groups, your probability of dying from homicide or war goes down. But it also means that the scale of the conflict, were it to occur, is higher. So there's actually a couple of processes, and it's hard to detect it because the data isn't quite there, but it's consistent with what I can see, which is that there's always the lower scales. It's like the bacteria, the insurgencies that are possible. But if we have this war, it's no longer bands against bands or even nations against nations. It's large unions of nations now armed with incredibly destructive new technologies against other large unions of nations, and the implications of that and the setback that can create can be a long time. So there's almost no point in saying um, the arc of justice, the arc of history bends toward justice, or violence is declining, or whatever. If you're about to live through a generation or 50 years of hardship because of this incredibly destructive thing. And so that's what I think, like, it's the social technologies, our ability to intervene and create the conditions for higher scales of cooperation, that is essential to ensuring that all of that technological stuff is actually used and when we avoid this crisis.
Yeah, that's very important. I'm going to come back to Elon Musk once again. Sorry, he seems to be a running theme in this podcast today. But one of the things that's kind of irritated me is many of my friends who detest Musk because of his political opinions, because they feel he is a troublemaker and an inflammatory element in politics. And I have been arguing always that what's much more important is that technological advancements that he's making possible, and which, if we get to Mars, it will probably be because of his ingenuity and determination, even if it's not directly him who takes us, but some copycat competitor, say. But I think that what you're saying is making me feel that perhaps my friends are right to be prioritizing the political, because without the political will for cooperation, none of those things can happen. We can't make use of the technologies effectively.
Yeah, but you see, I mean, so I mean, I would say, I'm I mean, first off, about Musk, right? If somebody's doing something very innovative and interesting and different, you don't expect this to be a normal person following the norms, right? Like you're not expecting the person who's like, yeah, I do everything what everybody expects me to do in society. That's not the person who's, who's making these breakthroughs. And I think like people who downplay the like, but he's not the guy building the rockets. I'm like, have you ever started a business? Like, it's not this easy thing. It's like that's why if you want to explain that, you got to explain why all these other, space attempts have failed. And that is kind of an evolutionary process in the sense, like, you've got different billionaires trying this different stuff, but creating the space for somebody to try and succeed is what I mean by the conditions for this to take off. Now,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
might say, yeah, the Musk is very divisive, and it clearly is. Lots of people leaving X for Blue Sky or whatever. But how you deal with that division is important because you can play the kind of trying to say this in a sensitive way, but the politics of giving in. I'm sure there's a more useful way to say that. Just to say some people feel badly about this, and we should try not to offend these people, and we need to give in. We need to. But I don't think that's right. I think that we ought to have robust and rigorous discussions about any topic. And if you want to show why Musk is wrong, you cannot appeal to just norms alone or your particular value set, which vary. You have to make kind of you have to make cases and argument that can cross those boundaries on the basis of something that approaches an objective metric. And I think that's often where things break down. Some people are like, I don't care about progress. Actually, I just care about concern or something like that. But that discussion, that working out of these things is absolutely essential. So I mean, I'm not sure exactly what I'm saying, but like you wouldn't want Musk to be less divisive necessarily. You want to encourage the kind of discussion that he's forcing us to have, or that he and others are forcing us to have, whether you like it or not. You're going to be offended and upset when somebody says something you disagree with, but fact is, people disagree on things, and yet we still have to work together as a species. And it is in that, there's a line that I have in my book from On Liberty, that we have to leave room for the uncustomary so that we may decide what shall in the future become customary. We
Yeah,
have to leave
that's
room
great.
for the crazy and offensive and truly awful so that we can decide if maybe it's not crazy and offensive and truly awful. Because I think it's hubris to think that in this moment right now, all the particular set of values that you have are the end state of values. At once upon a time, it was offensive to upset the social order. If you look at the holy books, they don't tell you not to have slaves; they tell you how to treat them. Now slavery for most people is unthinkable. Interracial marriage was at one point upset the social order. Right? It was just an awful thing. It was kind of an offensive thing, right? But you discuss these things. There are there's a robust, and it's fine. People have different opinions on all of these things. Maybe there are people among us who would want us to return to slavery or whatever. There might be a space. It's what freedom of speech allows for. It allows for us to go, actually, that's an awful idea. That's terrible. And, and here's the reasons why it doesn't work out. But it forces you to articulate that, whatever the crazy idea might be. So I'm,
It's like for
so when
evolution,
I say that we
even.
need to be able to
Yeah.
work together, I don't mean at the expense of truth. Um,
Mm.
there's another
Yeah.
side to this.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm talking a lot, but
Oh
yeah.
no, oh no, it's fine. I was just going to say that this is when we're talking about cultural evolution, one of the things you require for evolution is a certain degree of natural variance within the material that you
Exactly.
have to work
Exactly.
with. Um, yeah,
And so and that's
my
the other thing, of course, that I have to get out of, like, as someone who, it's a weird thing being someone who works on cultural evolution, in the sense that I have to get out of my own value set, if you like, and just say, here's what I think, but it actually doesn't matter. What all I can say is this thing is part of the variation. And
Mm,
if I were to look at it, I think this thing might outcompete this other thing. And I think it might outcompete it at a group level, or it might outcompete it at a lower level. And, when I'm intervening, of course, I might have some principles behind that. But we cannot know, right? And by the way, what outcompetes doesn't make it good, right? Sparta might outcompete
mm,
Athens, or the more violent society might outcompete the more peaceful society. What I would like is, the one that is able to outcompete it with the least amount of destruction, and that continues human progress. And so, if I were trying to find some value set that seems to be espoused by the major world religions, and I think is a secular aspiration too, it's higher scales of cooperation.
mm.
It's alignment where we can work together at a higher scale than our ancestors did.
I think that's probably a great place to end. But is there anything that I haven't asked you that you wish I'd asked you, or is anything you wish you'd had an opportunity to talk about?
There's loads of things, but I mean, I think, like I wrote the book out of frustration because I felt like there were all these ways of thinking about the world, tools for thinking about the world, that directly speak to the challenges that we face in the present moment, and it gives us a language to think about difficult topics that are sometimes taboo, that sometimes have hard answers, and it's very difficult to say my way is better than your way unless you have some basis upon which you can say it. My hope is that, it's like, to move us from alchemy to chemistry, like doing silly things to actually being able to do useful things, and eventually protein folding or something like that, is that you understand the rules by which the system operates. We have a common language for talking about cultural evolution, for example. And
Mm,
from there, then we can start to talk about things that are difficult, about whether, the divisiveness we see, let's say in the United States, is a good or a bad thing. Whether
mm,
the particular policies that are being implemented, should we seal the border, or is illegal immigration perfectly okay? What are it's moving beyond just looking at the data alone. Because, if you looked at the data alone, you wouldn't notice the effects of energy. You wouldn't notice it because it was so high for so long. It didn't matter. It wasn't the limiting agent. And it was only once it started to collapse that it started to become part of the equations that matter. So I think, the theory and the way of thinking about this stuff is just as important as the data. These things have to go hand in hand. That was my book is the attempt to kind of put that together and give people a language, and then directly target these various problems that we face.
Thanks so much. It's a fabulous book. I highly recommend it to everyone. And thank you for
Thanks very
coming on
much.
the podcast, Michael.
Thank you, Ayana. Thanks for having me on.